the last presentation, I addressed the pros and cons of the two main economic models, and in particular, emphasized the moral and spiritual implications of each. Both theories seem rational and make sense until you insert the human variable. Well, let's summarize the problems, first of all, with the current systems, starting with capitalism. Capitalism, of course, is our system in the West, and frankly, it's the predominant economic system in the world. And it is the one I think we assume as valid when we begin thinking about the moral and creative dimensions of economic systems, or at least it's the starting point, our frame of reference. But the West has also been shaped by the values and morality of Judaism and Christianity. And it's the Christian tradition in particular that has been a major source of a critical perspective on capitalism. With it came a radical new moral view of equality. For there is no Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, male nor female, the Christian scriptures teach us. And with Christianity came a particular concern for the poor and the oppressed and the suffering, an emphasis that we inherited from Judaism. So it shouldn't surprise us that the earliest Christian communities were indeed socialist in nature. And though it did not last very long, the founders, of course, of movements are usually willing to make great sacrifices. But as the movement expands and grows over time, new converts are less willing to make the same sacrifices. But still, the radical shift in values that Christianity brought informed the later cultural critiques of capitalism. And today, we do recognize the exploitive nature of this economic system and the inequality that often results from it. But capitalists recognize that as well, believe it or not. The World Economic Forum, which is based in Geneva, Switzerland, is a gathering of the rich and powerful of the world, the one percenters. It began in 1971 with this idea and mission. The forum strives in all its efforts to demonstrate entrepreneurship in the global public interest while upholding the highest standards of governance. Moral and intellectual integrity is at the heart of everything it does. Our activities are shaped by a unique institutional culture founded on the stakeholder theory, which asserts that an organization is accountable to all parts of society. The institution carefully blends and balances the best of many kinds of organizations, from both the public and private sectors, international organizations, and academic institutions. Now, I would like to mention the recent World Economic Forum, which gathered in Davos, Switzerland in 2020. And I want to remind you that the attendees are not exactly a group of dangerous leftists. In fact, they are quite the opposite. But they did recognize that one of the greatest dangers of capitalism, unregulated capitalism, is inequality. And our current inequality is close to pre-World War I levels. Now, the participants in the forum in 2020 are indeed worried about the growing gap between rich and poor to the point where they feel it is the #1 threat to economic and political stability. This came from the economic elite. The forum's 2020 manifesto states, quote, "The purpose of a company is to engage all its stakeholders in shared and sustained value creation. In creating such value, a company serves not only its shareholders, but all its stakeholders, employees," notice it is listed first, "customers, suppliers, local communities, and society at large." The best way to understand and harmonize the divergent interests of all stakeholders is through a shared commitment, worker and CEO, capitalist, a shared commitment to policies and decisions that strengthen the long-term prosperity of a company. Now, wow, that sounds virtuous, doesn't it? Well, there are cynics who may claim that this is merely PR, an attempt of the economic elite to placate the masses and the media who often criticize the exploitative nature and excesses of capitalism. But what if we took these 1%ers at their word? If we did, I believe we might become more curious as to how the best side of capitalism, its creative ability to solve problems, might be used to overcome its own tendencies towards exploitation of human capital and the environment. Sawyer, will you close that door for me? Sorry, we have some music pouring into our room here. Now, in the last presentation, we also saw there are problems with socialist systems. Looking at the historical record, socialist systems seem to disincentivize excellence, the religious and philosophical call to actualize one's full potential. And when you put people in government positions in socialist societies, human nature tends to rear its dark side as well. Inefficient bureaucracies form with power-corrupted officials resorting to coercive measures which diminish personal freedoms, including creative freedoms of artistic and spiritual expression. Now, what about the good in both of these systems? Socialism promotes the dignity and worth of all people. It attempts to overcome the evils of exploitation and relieve the suffering of the least of these among us. Socialist countries have recognized that people, if given too much freedom in a free market-driven society, will serve their self-interest to the detriment of their neighbor, will serve their self-interest to the detriment of the environment. The government then must step in to manage the economy and, more significantly, manage the people. But what if you're a creative person? The coercive management of the government stifles your artistic and entrepreneurial freedom. Now, capitalism calls each person to embrace their inalienable freedom and encourages them to use that freedom to actualize their highest potential in service to society by solving problems through creativity and imagination and create jobs in the process. Instead of trying to coerce people to do the right thing, capitalist societies have tried to use people's natural inclination towards self-interest, but do it in service to the greater whole. Creative people have found more freedom of expression in capitalist societies, historically speaking. Instead of relying on the government to do the good work, individuals have been encouraged to step up and participate, which benefits them at a very deep level and, in theory at least, benefits society. But these are the ideals of each of these economic systems. In reality, capitalism in the West is often described as cutthroat, and socialism is often described as enabling. But there are many countries who have experimented with mitigating the worst in each system while trying to utilize the best in both systems. And I'd like to offer the example of the country that has been listed as the happiest place to live in the world for the last 4 years by the World Happiness Report, which in its latest statistics relied on the analytics of the researcher Gallup. That country is Finland. In fact, the Nordic countries hold 5 of the top 8 positions in the latest rankings in the Happiness Report. 5 of the top 8, just the Nordic countries. And what do they all have in common? They have capitalist economies mitigated by welfare state policies, such as free healthcare and education, family and housing benefits, unemployment benefits and survivor benefits, as well as pensions for all. So everyone can live once they are no longer able to work. The welfare system in Finland takes care of all its citizens from cradle to grave. However, that means they do have higher taxes than most countries. But overall, the citizens don't complain because of the sense of well-being that living in such a state brings. Remember, 4 straight years, the happiest country in the world. Finland's Prime Minister, Sanna Marin, made headlines in December 2019 by becoming the world's youngest prime minister at the age of 34. She also is a beneficiary of the welfare state. Santa Marin grew up in humble circumstances, and her mother relied on subsidies from the government in order to survive and raise her children. But Finland's guarantee of quality education for all, up through the degree level, gave Marin an opportunity people living in poor communities in the United States don't really have. In an article for the Washington Post, while she attended the World Economic Forum in 2020 in Davos, which I just mentioned, she stated, quote, "I feel that the American dream can be achieved best in the Nordic countries, where every child, no matter their background or the background of their families, can become anything." Many in the West believe the Nordic countries are socialist, but their economies, like I said before, are based on capitalism. They like to refer to their economic systems as friendlier, kinder forms of capitalism, or the term that I read was cuddlier or cuddly capitalism. I mentioned Nordic countries have 5 of the top 8 spots in the happiness report. The others are Denmark, Norway, Iceland, and Sweden. And their political and economic systems are called collectively the Nordic Model. The Nordic model comprises the economic and social policies as well as typical cultural practices common to these Nordic countries, and these include a comprehensive welfare state and multi-level collective bargaining between worker and capitalist based on the economic foundations of social corporatism, with a high percentage of workforce unionized and a sizable percentage of the population employed by the public sector. Now, the government invests in business in these Nordic countries heavily, but taxes them at around 20% for the favor. But that's still less than the 30+% that regular workers are taxed in these countries. But the result of all this in these countries is a kinder form of free market capitalist society, because they've integrated socialist policies into the economy and society to offset some of the troubling aspects of capitalism, particularly inequality of income and services. But can such a hybrid economic system, if I can call it that, be sustained long-term? Well, we'll see, I guess, in the next decade or so. It's worked for the last 2. Now, there are still moral problems even with this hybrid model. Even in Nordic countries, buying the usual products like clothes, shoes, handbags, and banking in the main financial institutions and investing in several companies to grow our wealth often means we are supporting organizations that exploit human beings, pollute and degrade the planet. Many of Claude Monet's paintings, perhaps unwittingly, reveal the heavy smog and pollution in industrial London. Many spiritual seekers and artistic types I know live by the adage, do no harm, or do the least harm one can. And so they do their best to live by another economic model, which they believe avoids many of the ills of both socialism and capitalism, and even these hybrid systems. They are trying to live a life of simplicity or self-sufficiency by going off grid, you might say. Their lifestyle looks as if they've gone back in time to a simpler way of life, when people were entirely self-sufficient, growing their own food, caring for their own health, namely through hearty living and herbal remedies, and bartering for the extras in life. Maybe they've read The Gift by Lewis Hyde, which I mentioned during the presentation last week, and which describes such a mindset and way of living. Such simplicity and self-reliance is experienced as a spiritual way of life, compared to the feverish hustle and bustle of the acquisitive life and hyper obsession with productivity. Some call this escaping the matrix, but it is founded on the high moral principle, not only of Judaism and Christianity, but of many Eastern spiritual traditions of stewardship of the planet and compassion for others. That means we appreciate the gift of the natural world and our fellow human beings. And we live in such a way where we do our best not to oppress other sentient beings. And that means other life forms that have feelings. Nor do we oppress the environment, nor participate or invest in organizations that oppress. Now, such adherents claim it is an authentically Jewish and Christian and Buddhist or just plain spiritual way of living. You shall not defile the land in which you live, in the midst of which I dwell, for I, the Lord, dwell in the midst of the people of Israel. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell therein. But ask the beasts, and they will teach you, the birds of the heavens, and they will tell you, or the bushes of the earth, and they will teach you, and the fish of the sea will declare to you. Who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? In his hand is the life of every living thing and the breath of all mankind. So with such spiritual teachings as our guide, perhaps we will adjust our lives and those of our children. Instead of playing video games or staring at a TV or computer screen all day, we and our children will play outside. Or we'll play with homemade toys. Or perhaps just be the naturally creative artists most children and some of us are. How many of us would prefer our children or grandchildren creating art rather than playing video games or watching television, where they are bombarded with ads claiming their life won't be fulfilled unless they own the next electronic gadget or widget? Now, all this looks and sounds charming, romantic. And some of us might be able to remember relatives who actually lived like this. But it's a bit harder of a life to pull off. How many of us are willing to give up cell phones because they may have been created by child slave labor in a far-off country? How many of us are willing to change the types of car we drive or drive no car at all because of its impact on the environment? How many of us are willing to forego TV and most websites because they constantly expose us and our children to consumerism and other forms of materialism that never satisfy the deep needs of our souls? In fact, they often constrict the soul, possibly even corrupt it. Are we willing to step away from all the conveniences of the modern West, so captivating with the fruit of technology, luxury goods, and wealth, in order to live an austere and simpler lifestyle so that we can experience greater peace with ourselves? Is such a life really possible? The fact is, most people in the West who choose this type of lifestyle either have alternative sources of income, perhaps some passive income, or keep a part-time job. They still must make some compromises with the capitalistic culture, but they do feel they are doing the least harm. And the ones I know who have done this seem to have greater peace in their life, in their simplicity of living, that most of the rest of us don't have. They have less incongruity in their soul, in other words, less incongruity in their souls. The Gospel of Thomas defines salvation in this way: when you are able to make two become one, the inside like the outside, and the outside like the inside, the higher like the lower, so that a man is no longer male and a woman female, but male and female become a single whole. When you are able to fashion an eye to replace an eye, and form a hand in place of a hand, or a foot for a foot, making one image supersede another, then you will enter in. Now, what does this ancient wisdom saying actually mean? But for one, our egoic mind divides reality into opposites, which creates a state of constant judgment and evaluation and division. And it also causes spiritual dissonance, separating our inward life from our external life. Our inner values make us feel morally upright, but our desires and behaviors often conflict with those internal values. And so we become a divided self at war with ourselves, with a resulting vague emotional agitation and enigmatic guilt, that strange sense of not being quite right within ourselves, which leads us to develop a destructive relationship with outer things, like addictive substances or compulsive behaviors or consumerism. In other words, our spiritual incongruence ultimately leads to suffering. What are your values? The ones you declare to your conscious self and that you present to the world. Is there any conflict between what you espouse and your lifestyle in this capitalistic society of ours? Are your investments congruent with those values? If not, what do you think that is doing to your soul? Do you have a don't ask, don't tell agreement with yourself when it comes to the clothes or shoes you buy, so that you don't find out if they are made in a sweatshop by a child who's been taken out of school so that we might have the latest style of handbag? Are you at peace with yourself in your economic life? Now, I'm not here to accuse or to judge. I'm asking the same questions of myself. Am I willing to pay the price for greater spiritual congruency by questioning my financial decisions? When feeling especially nostalgic and romantic, I've entertained the option of escaping the economic matrix of my society and living simply off the land and bartering my services for the necessities of life, which are actually quite few. But this is only daydreaming, because honestly, I do feel too reliant on the wonders, the products, the conveniences that capitalism has given all of us. But sometimes I ask myself, at what price am I enjoying these glittery products? At what price am I enjoying this comfortable life? At what price? What compromises have we made with our soul living in this economic system that we live in? And what changes could we make living within this system that would allow us to use its fruits to do the most good while minimizing harm to ourselves, others, and to this planet? I think such a contemplative exercise, regularly performed, might contribute to a greater sense of well-being, and perhaps even change us for the better. It might even begin to change the system for the better. Something I hope we will consider moving forward. Thank you again for the gift of your time and attention.